Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of March of 2024. Today we have significant number of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to discuss once again the Ukrainian attack against the Russian fleet. This morning we got the video confirmation of how the Ukrainians managed to discover in the sea and to destroy the Russian ship Sergei Kotov, and as a result of FPV Navy drone strikes that ship was destroyed. On this video we see just one strike. Later the Ukrainian intelligence services published additional video material, based on this video we can see that Ukrainians used significant number of drones. Probably there were 2, 3 or 5 or even 6 attacks against the ship, lots of explosions, and very likely the ship was sank and was destroyed. However, the Russian sources are saying that they managed to save the crew, nobody was damaged, everything is okay, they lost just the ship. And I'll remind you that since the beginning of the year, the Russians have already lost 4 ships. For example, Cesar Kurnikov, this ship was destroyed on the 14th of February of 2024. And the next ship, Ivanovets, this ship was destroyed on the 1st of February of 2024. And today the Russians lost the patrol boat, this one, with the number 383. And this boat was destroyed on the 5th of March of 2024. And some people might say that this event with destroyed Russian ship was probably the most interesting event of the 5th of March of 2024, but I will probably disappoint you. That was probably the beginning of just the most interesting updates that we received during the day. And first let's talk about Kherson, of course, and Odessa direction. The Russians, as a result of act of revenge, attacked Odessa heavily with significant number of drones and missiles. There were lots of explosions. The Russians attacked the boats, the warehouses, the port infrastructure. The Russians attacked some buildings and temporary possible positions of Ukrainian armed forces. For now, we don't have lots of geolocated videos telling us, let's say where we can see the real results of the strikes. We have just reports from the ground. Now we're moving to Kherson direction, and probably the most interesting part of the video is starting. First, let's start from this icon. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published the video of how they managed to discover and destroy the Ukrainian ammo depot somewhere in Kherson direction in the vicinity of the village by the name of Charivne. On this video we can see the results of the strike, so basically the consequences, we see the secondary detonation and so on. Later, the Russians published additional geolocations in the vicinity of the village by the name of Galaganovka, the village that located along Ingulets River. On this video, we can see how the Russians managed to discover with the drone significant number of Ukrainian forces that were trying to hide somewhere in the forest along the river. The Russians discovered the concentration of forces, and as a result of Iskander strike, that temporary base of Ukrainian forces was completely destroyed. Very unlikely something was able to survive under such a heavy fire of Iskander missile. But that was not the final update. Later we got additional report from the vicinity of Nikolaev. The Russian sources, the Russian intelligence managed to discover 2 Ukrainian HIMARS systems that were moving somewhere in the vicinity of the village Kotlярova to the south of Mykolaiv. The Ukrainians probably tried to hide them after the HIMARS system was completely empty without missiles. The Russians managed to discover their positions. They sent coordinates to appropriate authorities, and after a few minutes probably the Russians conducted successful Iskander strike, and as a result of another Iskander strike 2 additional HIMARS systems were destroyed. So that was a very interesting time on Kherson and Crimean direction. We see significant number of geolocations, significant clashes, and I'll remind you, if we increase the numbers of updates on Kherson direction, let's say from the 1st of February, we can count the number of HIMARS strike that Ukrainians conducted in this area. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, probably more than 10 HIMARS strikes were geolocated and confirmed on Kherson direction, and those HIMARS strikes probably were conducted by those HIMARS systems that the Russians managed to discover and to destroy during the previous 24 hours. Now we are moving further to Zaporozhye direction. We haven't received anything from the area, so that's why we will bypass the territory and we will continue with South Donetsk direction. and the southern part of Donetsk area. Today, the Russian forces continue offensive operation in the vicinity of Novomykhailivka. During the day, we got lots of updates. This morning started with a report from Siversk maps and from Rybar that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the farms that located to the south of the central area of Novomykhailivka. So this area was captured by the Russians by the morning, and that was the configuration of the line of combat contact before the beginning of the day. Later, right before I start making the video, we got two interesting things, one photo and one geolocation. The photo we received from the central part of Novomykhailivka to the northwest of the church in the central part, and as you can see, the Russian soldiers were establishing the flag on this post office. So we can say that Novomykhailivka has fallen because the Russians managed to establish control over the high-rise building, and everything that located to the west is just small buildings, and where the Ukrainians don't have chances to hold positions for a long time, because the main fortifications were located in the eastern part, in the central part, and in the farms to the north. But by the progress of the Russian forces in the central part, we see that the entire defense belt of Ukrainian forces was collapsed. So currently, according to geolocations we have, we can make a conclusion that this part of Novomykhailivka is under complete Russian control. We will adjust the map before the next video, and this is the progress in this area. But that was not the only updates from Novomykhailivka. Also, before I start making the video, we got additional video from the Ukrainian sources of Russian attack with very powerful armored fist. As you can see, 5 armored vehicles with personnel carriers and tanks, and with a significant number of infantry were heading to the Ukrainian positions, to the southeastern positions of Novomykhailivka. I would like to point your attention to this personnel carrier. As you can see, this personnel carrier has, let's say, unusual defense roof on top of the personnel carrier. This is not just something regular anti-drone, let's say, shield. This is something more, not just against drones, but probably for something else. And in the end of this video, we will understand what are the other purposes the Russians were using this something armored on top of the personnel carriers. So the Russians entered the territory, then they started landing the infantry. The infantry landed in the area and started clearing operation. But the Russians wasn't in a hurry. First of all, they made a decision to dig in deeper in this area and to create the first defense belt. And now you will understand the purpose and the real reasons of these unusual, let's say, iron armored hats, armored shields on top of the personal carriers. This is something like a temporary fire position. So this personal carrier can, let's say, drop these armored vehicles on the ground, and the Russians can use, the soldiers on this area can use them as a shield against FPV drone strikes, and these small windows to use as the fire gun and machine gun positions. So we'll see in a minute. So another tactics that the Russians start using, usually in the previous clashes, the Russians were abandoning their positions, abandoning their tanks, and after that they tried to establish control over the trenches. But now the Russians changed their tactics and they start using these personal carriers as the base for further defense belt. So as you can see, Russian soldier was making trenches and fortifications below the abandoned tank. So of course these tactics will increase the survivability of Russian soldiers, and of course the Ukrainians have less chances to destroy them. Another video, personal carrier entered some small hole in the surface, and the Russians start building the trenches below this armored vehicle. Very likely this armored vehicle was empty without something that can make a very big explosion. So this is something new that the Russians start using against the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians of course attacked this personal carrier with FPV drones, and we see that one of the personal carriers was destroyed as a result of attacks. But anyway, what we have just seen on the video, the Russians were attacking something like this, and as a result of offensive operation they managed to enter this territory, and after that the Russians start creation of the foothold in this area using abandoned armored vehicles as the base for the further fortification. So we see that the main Russian purpose during that attack was to create a strong foothold, with the next purpose to move further to the southeastern and the eastern part of Novomykhailivka, with the purpose to cut the Ukrainians in the western part of the village completely from the mainland and to create a cauldron. Anyway, I I'll repeat my idea that Novomykhailivka has fallen. Currently, the Ukrainians don't have chances to hold this area for a very long time. The numbers of the clearing operation of the village are numbered, and very likely the progress is much bigger in comparison we have just discussed, and very likely the Ukrainians currently have just some positions on the western part, and they control something like this. The rest of Novomykhailivka either under Russian control or in the gray zone. So this is the situation for this village. Now we are moving further to the northern part, and as we discussed in the previous morning update, I will just repeat a few words. According to some mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control almost over entire Centralny Street of Georgievka, and to enter the central part, and to enter Молодежная Street. This is Молодежная Street, and currently, according to mappers and some reporters and sources on the ground, this is the current progress of the Russian forces inside of the village. So the battle for the village has started. The Russians, before moving further, made the decision, decided to, let's say, dig in deeper, and they start clearing of these trenches. And if they're able to capture the trenches, then they're going to have a very big and powerful stronghold in the area, very powerful foothold for further offensive, further to Maximilianovka and Georgievka. On this video, we can see the process of artillery preparation and attempts to clear the trenches out of the Ukrainian forces. After that, the Russians launched the ground operation. From the other side, the Russians continue advancing further to the north in direction of Krasnogorovka. And according to some mappers, before this day started, the Russians have already established control over these territories. And today, the Russians managed to get additional advance, additional progress. The Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions along these trenches. If you zoom in, we're going to see the trenches. And the Russians managed to establish control over them. And by the end of the day, the current Russian progress in this area was something like this, without any geolocated confirmation. So the Russians captured the territory, and this is significant progress because of the fact that the Russians established control over these trenches. Basically, they managed to secure the progress and the movements of the Russian forces through these fields. And also, because from these trenches, the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian offensives, let's say with anti-tank missiles, and everything that was moving along these fields were destroyed as a result of attack from those trenches. But now the trenches are cleared and captured by the Russians, and the sources are saying that by the end of the day, before I start making the video, the Russians managed to establish control over these fields and over the tree lines along the railways as well. So by the end of the 5th of March, this is approximately the progress of the Russian armed forces in this area. Obviously, this is a very powerful, let's say, and strong foothold, and currently the Ukrainians have no chances to force the Russians to fall back. The Russians are able to concentrate the critical mass, and very likely first they will secure the area between Georgievka and Krasnogorovka by taking the strongholds in the fields, and after that the Russians will rush to the Krasnogorovka to the north. And now we're moving to Nevelske. The clashes in the village continues as well, in Pervomaiske as well. According to some mappers, the Russians have already established control over more than 50% of the village, and this is approximately the Russian control in this area. And from the other side, we see additional attempts from the Russian side to attack Nevelske itself. According to unconfirmed geolocations, this is the Russian progress by the morning of the 5th of March. And today, the Ukrainians tried to stabilize the area in the village by sending significant number of armored vehicles, personnel carriers, some support machines to Nevelske, but most of those vehicles were attacked and destroyed by the Russian FPV drone operators on their move, and lots of armored vehicles were damaged, destroyed, and then abandoned by the Ukrainians. So currently the Ukrainians don't have any resistance to the Russians, and very likely that by the end of the week Nevelske will be also captured by the Russians. So all these videos tells me about this. And if the Russians are able to establish control over the village and to capture these territories, then the Ukrainian situation is going to get completely bad, and the Russians will receive the gates and the opened window to move further to the main supply road that goes from Krasnogorovka from Zhelan Druga, and this entire area can collapse and the Ukrainians can start running away very fast. Furthermore, if the Russians are able to establish control over Nevelske, the Ukrainian positions in this stronghold in the northwestern part of Pervomaiske will appear in something like artillery pocket, and they will be forced to fall back as well. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, to Avdiivka direction. As you can see, we have some additional updates. The clashes continues in Tonninka, the clashes continues in Orlovka, but the most fierce and bloody clashes are taking place in Berdychi. For some reasons, either the Russians and the Ukrainians made a decision to use this foothold as the main battle for the area. And when talking about the territory, today we got a lot of geolocations, and today the Russians, as a result of, let's say, some special operation, managed to destroy third Abrams on direction, not Abrams based machine, but third, let's say, classical Abrams. And on this first we got something like photos in the morning of destroyed Abrams of the local time. Those were just photos. Later we additional sources published the video of anti-tank strike. On this video we can see the Abrams who was heading to the line of combat contact, probably to fire position, with the purpose to start attacking the Russians in Stepova, but the Russians discovered the Abrams and attacked the Abrams with anti-tank missile. And after the strike, the Abrams lost its possibilities to move and stopped. And then we got, after a very heavy explosion, Abrams, probably the Ukrainian tank drivers, abandoned the vehicle and ran away. Anyway, after that, the Russians launched the second missile, and probably as a result of the second strike, the Ukrainians lost chances completely to evacuate or to do anything with this tank. And later we got additional video, the video from the drone that was flying above the territory. On this video we can see the Russian drone who was filming the Berdychi area. This is, for example, the tree lines. This is the tree lines on the satellite. This is on the map. This is on the video. And take a look at the bottom corner, left bottom corner. There is an explosion, and this is exactly the attack against the Ukrainian Abrams with anti-tank missiles. So this is the situation in this area. But this video first of all confirms and that the Russians don't have control over Berdychi. If you remember the previous configuration of the map, according to geolocations, we have adjusted the map and the territory, this territory under Russian control. But today we got significant number of geolocations with Abrams, with tanks, and we changed the map, and now this territory is in the gray zone or under Ukraine control. Furthermore, the Russians published the video of how they managed to reach the engineering-based, Abrams-based engineering machine. Very likely this tank will be evacuated very soon and will be moved to Kremlin, and people will make a lot of selfies with this engineering machine. And the Ukrainian sources published the video of Russian attempts to attack once again, to storm assault Berdychi. The Russians were attacking Berdychi with the small stormtroopers groups, but the Ukrainians controlled the situation, the forces of 47th Brigade, and they were bombing the Russians. So this is the situation in the area. The clashes here continues, but as you can see, without any progress either for the Russians and the Ukrainian side. But anyway, according to the common situation, the line of combat contact all over the entire Ukraine, very likely Berdychi will fall very soon and the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back. And now we are moving further to the north, and the first thing I would like to discuss with you, the video that also was published right before I start making this episode. On this video we can see another HIMARS somewhere in the vicinity of the village by the name of Mayaki, and the Russians discovered the HIMARS, and then the Russian attacked these HIMARS with the Tornado S system, and HIMARS was successfully destroyed. So that was the third HIMARS during the previous 24 hours. Once again, just before this moment, the Ukrainians lost 3 HIMARS systems, 1 concentration of forces, was one S-300 system. The Ukrainians lost more than half of Novomykhailivka, and the Ukrainians are doing this because the Russians are in a very aggressive offensive state, and the Ukrainians are forced to move their forces and their vehicles as close as possible to line of combat contact, because they need to slow down the Russians. But the Russian intelligence and their drone capabilities are very, let's say, experienced and very cool, very high. So that's why when the Ukrainians move their forces very close to the line of combat contact, the Russians destroy it immediately. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, Ivanovsk, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction. We got, as you can see, significant number of geolocations, but the most important updates are coming from Ivanovsk. According to the Russians, they managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in the south and central and the northern part, and according to most of the mappers and reliable resources without geolocated confirmations, the Russians currently control something like this. So approximately this is the progress of the Russian armed forces by the end of the 5th of March. It's for now we don't have, let's say, 100 proofs of this progress, but very likely this is something like this. Furthermore, we start receiving significant number of videos with prisoners of war. The Ukrainians start surrendering because they see no chances to fight, and because of additional reason that we will discuss in a minute. As you can see, the main, let's say, one of the reasons why the Russians managed to capture Ivanovska is that they continue every single day bomb and attack this hill without any possibilities for the Ukrainians to raise their heads. This area once again was under very heavy fire from the Russian side, and the Ukrainians basically from the territory couldn't control the area, and they were forced to fall back. After successful work, the Russian Su-25s returned back to to the mainland, to the bases, and after that probably they made another round of attack. Furthermore, we got the video from Ivanovska itself. On this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the village. As you can see, the entire village was covered with the artillery, let's say, smoke, and we see that the Russians are bombing the western part, the Ukrainian positions. And the most important part of the video is the road. This is the main supply road that Ukrainians used to have at least months ago. Now we can calculate the number of armored vehicles that were abandoned and destroyed along the road. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, probably around 10 armored vehicles and even more were abandoned and destroyed along the road that Ukrainians were used to use for supplying and supporting of their garrison there. So we see this is another operational encirclement with control of the N32 road, with no chances for the Ukrainians to hold this area very long. From the other side, the Russians continue bombing of Chasiv Yar with the purpose to pin the Ukrainians down and not to allow them to counterattack the Russians in their flank while the active phase of the battle for Ivanovska. The sources published the topographical map of the area to give us better understanding that Chasiv Yar is the last town on the hill, and after that there is a very big lowlands, and most of the Ukrainian towns, next cities in this area like Konstantinovka, Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhba are located in the lowlands, and they are very well controlled from the hill of Chasiv Yar. Now we are moving to Liman direction. The Russians published additional video of how they managed to discover and destroy another Ukraine S-300 system, and if correct me if I'm wrong, for the previous 3 weeks the Russians published up to 5 destroyed S-300 systems on the line of combat contact. The Russians are using aviation massively, Su-30, Su-34, Su-35. The Russians use guided bombs. They send hundreds of guided bombs each day, and of course this is the reason of Russian progress. This is the reason why the Ukrainians are losing this special military operation, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians are forced to keep HIMARS systems, Abrams and S-300 systems on the line of combat contact, and this is the reason of very heavy losses of these types of weapon. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians managed to discover Ukrainian AS-90 self-propelled howitzer, and as a result of Russian counter-artillery duel with attack with Krasnopol, that howitzer was destroyed. So once few seconds later, after the howitzer made few strikes, the Russians counter-attack and destroyed this. Now we're moving to Terny direction. Once again, according to very reliable sources, the Russians not just haven't entered the Terny village, but according to some sources, the Russians are about to finish the storming operation of the village, and according to some mappers, this is approximately the Russian control. So we don't have any geolocations. We can just, it's up to you whether to believe this or not, but some sources once again are saying that the Russians are about to finish the establishing control over the village, and of course this is going to be collapse and disaster for the Ukrainians. Northern direction, no updates. Now we are moving to Kiev. We got a lot of updates from the area, and one of the most important to my mind was published today by the Russian very reliable sources, that there are active rumors in the general staff of the armed forces of Ukraine that several senior officers, generals who have already been dismissed from the armed forces of Ukraine for connections with former commander-in-chief Zaluzhny have gone over to the side of the Russian armed forces. One of the staff officers of the Ukrainian High Command was helped to take his family to Russia. So, and this is a very big problem, because these people had a lot of access to secret information, confidential information, and they changed their side. And it's, that just because they don't like Zelensky, it's not a reason to change the side, to change the motherland from Ukraine to Russia. Only something bigger, something worse can force the Ukrainian generals to change the side, and some understanding of the basis and the real reasons of the war, and that this war is controlled not by the Ukrainians and not for Ukrainian freedom, but this war is run by the Western countries and for the Western interest. So only this understanding of the situation can force the Ukrainian generals to change the side and to start fighting for Russia. Very interesting update. Furthermore, we got another important report about the lost missing soldiers. The Washington Post stated, with reference to the armed forces of Ukraine, that based on the results of the audit, the armed forces of Ukraine were missing 700,000 military personnel. personnel. This is something that does not fail into the official lie about 31,000 losses. What's so important about this number? And I'm not talking about the number of losses. You know that when I first saw this post, this article, first thing that came to my mind is the let's say paper army of Afghanistan. If you remember, when the United States of America left Afghanistan, according to papers, Afghanistan had around 300,000 soldiers, and Biden was saying that there is no reason to be afraid of Afghanistan because they have significantly big army and they can fight with other, let's say, fractions in the region. But when something went wrong, we found out that there were no army, and the army was just on the paper, and the NATO countries were paying salary to those soldiers, and that was just another scheme of corruption. So when I see the number of 700,000 soldiers, very likely that this is also a scheme of corruption, because the Ukrainians were received money to supply the army, munition to this army, and nobody knows where exactly all these things went after this equipment and munition arrived to the territory of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians failed mobilization, and now they need to fulfill this gap of 700,000, but they know exactly how to do this. And once again, according to some Russian sources, the level of loss of the Ukrainians is around 600,000 since the beginning of the special military operation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.